You think you know the Vikings. Fierce warriors, bloodthirsty raiders, helmeted barbarians with horns and a lust for gold. But what if I told you that much of what you believe is wrong? Let's start. 1. Vikings wore horned helmets. Let's get the most obvious one out of the way. No, Vikings did not wear horned helmets into battle. The image of the horned Viking came from the 19th century, specifically from costume designers working on Wagner's opera Der Ring des Nibelungen. It looked dramatic. It wasn't historical. Real Viking helmets were conical, made of iron or leather, often with a nose guard and no horns. Why? Because horns are a terrible idea in close combat. They give your enemy something to grab. Also, iron was expensive. Very few Vikings even had helmets at all. Only one complete Viking Age helmet has ever been found in Gudmundbu, Norway. And guess what? It had 0 horns. So, unless you're going to a metal concert or a football game, and leave the horns at home. 2. Vikings were dirty and uncivilized. Imagine a Viking, what do you see? A filthy, unwashed brute, covered in blood and mud. Hollywood loves that image. But Viking hygiene? Surprisingly advanced. Vikings cared about cleanliness. Archaeologists have found grooming kits in nearly every Viking site. They bathed regularly at least once a week, often more. In fact, the word Saturday in Old Norse, Lagerdagur, literally washing day. Even Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, who hated the Vikings, complained that Norse men were too clean and used their cleanliness to seduce local women. Were they neat freaks by modern standards? Number. But for the Middle Ages, Vikings were doing pretty well. 3. Vikings were one people, one nation. The word Viking makes it sound like a single group, a united Norse army sailing under one flag. But that's far from the truth. Viking wasn't even an ethnic label. It was more of a job description. Vikingry meant pirate or raider. To go Viking, fara I Viking, meant to set off on an expedition, usually for raiding or trading. Not every Scandinavian was a Viking, and not all Vikings were Scandinavian. There was no unified Viking nation. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden weren't the centralized countries we know today. They were collections of tribes, clans, and petty kingdoms often at war with each other. So, next time someone says, the Vikings invaded, ask, which Vikings? 4. Vikings burned their dead in longships. It's one of the most cinematic images in Viking lore. A fallen warrior laid on a longship, set ablaze, drifting into the afterlife. But this scene? Pure Hollywood. Yes, Vikings did cremate their dead, but not usually in ships. Longships were expensive and rare. Burning one just for a funeral? Highly unlikely. Most Norse funerals were earthbound. The body might be cremated in a pyre and then buried in a mound. Sometimes stones were laid out in the shape of a ship, symbolically. We've found boat burials too, like the famous Oseberg and Gokstad ships in Norway, but these were for elites, and the ships were not set on fire. Burning a ship? That's not how you honor a Viking. That's how you waste a boat. 5. Viking women were fierce warriors. The modern obsession with shieldmaidens is strong. Books, games, shows, they all love the idea of fierce Viking women charging into battle with axe in hand. But how real is this myth? Well, it's complicated. First, let's clear this up. Norse women had more rights than many of their medieval counterparts. They could divorce, own property, and even wield some political power. But when it comes to battlefield evidence, things get tricky. In 2017, researchers re-examined a famous warrior grave from Birka, Sweden, long assumed to belong to a man. DNA proved it was a woman. Huge news, right? Yes, but one grave doesn't prove that female warriors were common. Most warrior burials are still male, and there's no clear evidence of organized female warrior units. So did some women fight? Probably. Were female warriors the norm? Not even close. Let's honor the real power Viking women had without turning them into fantasy figures. 6. Vikings were godless savages. They raided churches, they killed monks, they hated Christianity. So clearly, the Vikings were just brutal, godless heathens, right? Wrong again. The Norse had a complex and rich belief system, one filled with gods like Odin, Thor, Freyja, and Loki. They honored their deities with rituals, offerings, and stories passed through generations. Norse religion wasn't primitive. It had ethics, cosmology, and even apocalyptic prophecy, Ragnarok. They weren't atheists, they just didn't believe in your god. And here's the twist. Many Vikings did convert to Christianity over time. Not because they were forced, but because it helped them trade, gain allies, or marry into power. By the 11th century, most Scandinavians were Christian, at least officially. But the old gods didn't vanish overnight. They lingered in folklore, customs, and even Christmas traditions. Godless? Number. Just misunderstood. 7. Vikings blew giant horns before battle. It's an iconic moment in every Viking epic, the deep bellow of a war horn echoing through the mist, announcing death to come. But here's the question. Did Vikings really use these horns in war? Vikings did have horns, but not exactly the ones you're imagining. Some horns were for drinking. Others, like the ancient lyre, were indeed musical. But most of the lyres we've found predate the Viking Age by over 1,000 years. There's no solid evidence that Viking warriors routinely blew horns before battle. No Norse saga describes it, and no battlefield horn has been found from confirmed Viking contexts. The horned call of war? That's more Braveheart than Bjorn Ironside. Sorry, fans of dramatic soundtracks, the Vikings probably attacked in cold, terrifying silence. 8. Vikings discovered America before Columbus and settled it. Now here's a myth that is partly true, but still needs some clarification. Yes, the Vikings reached North America centuries before Columbus. That's not up for debate anymore. In the 1960s, researchers discovered a Norse site in Newfoundland, dating back to around the year 1000 AD. This proves that Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed from Greenland to a new land he called Vinland. But here's where the myth goes off course. Some believe the Vikings colonized America, that they established large settlements or even influenced native cultures. That part? Totally false. The Vinland settlement was small, short-lived, and likely abandoned within a few years. Why? Hostile locals, limited resources, and sheer distance from home. There's no evidence of lasting Viking presence, no Norse artifacts beyond that single site, and there's zero genetic or cultural Viking influence in indigenous populations. So yes, Leif Erikson got there first, but he didn't stay long. Columbus still gets credit for launching the global impact of the Americas, even if he was late to the party. 9. Vikings invented democracy. Modern media loves to portray Vikings as early champions of freedom and equality, rough-edged Democrats before democracy existed. It's a feel-good idea. But is it true? Well, sort of. Vikings did have assemblies called things Shing in Old Norse. These were meetings where free men could settle disputes, pass laws, and make decisions. Iceland's Althing is often called the world's oldest parliament. And yes, it's still running today. But parliament might be a stretch. Viking society wasn't exactly egalitarian. It was hierarchical, with powerful chieftains dominating the thing. Women, slaves, thralls, and most outsiders had no say at all. So, were the Vikings the fathers of democracy? Not quite. But they did value law, negotiation, and public assembly, which, in the violent medieval world, was pretty progressive. 10. Vikings disappeared without a trace. Our final myth may be the most poetic, that the Vikings, like their ships, vanished into the mist, gone without a trace. But history doesn't work like that. The Viking Age ended, but the Vikings didn't. They evolved. By the 11th century, Norse societies had converted to Christianity, formed centralized kingdoms, and integrated into the broader European world. The same people who once raided monasteries were now building cathedrals. Genetically, culturally, and politically, the legacy of the Vikings lives on. You see it in Scandinavian languages, surnames, and even legal traditions. They didn't disappear. They just stopped going Viking. So here we are, 10 myths, shattered and stripped of legend. But the truth? It's just as fascinating. The Vikings weren't horned devils or freedom-loving angels. They were human, complex, brutal, clever, curious. They shaped history not with fantasy, but with fire, sails, and memory.